Happy Friday. Happy Friday, everybody. Welcome to another one of our weekly privacy chats and one of our regular privacy book club discussions. Kudos to you who've been sticking with this for, wow, a couple of years now. We started this long before COVID and have had a chance to talk to, I don't know, maybe 20 or so different authors on all kinds of tech policy books, data protection books. This has been one of the most exciting ones because Kashmir Hill, as many of you know from her reporting over the years, is a writer who gets a little bit behind the scenes and gives you a bit of the human flavor and the drama, and really brings some of these issues to sort of why we ought to care about them in a real way. And she does certainly this. It almost opens like a detective novel where she's trudging around Manhattan, pregnant, knocking on doors, just like doing everything to hunt down the story. And it also sets the stage for sort of a shadiness that seems to have, existed. All startups are chaotic and there's disputes and founders and, drama, especially with, entrepreneurs. But all throughout the book, Kashmir captures, I think, some of the just unusual nature, whether it's unusual connections to sort of the extremes of party politics, New York City politics, the Silicon Valley startup swamp. Anyway, I don't need to give much more of an introduction to Kashmir Hill. Many of you know her more recent writing at the New York Times, but she's been breaking stories and shedding light on data protection stories, tech policy stories for many years. I remember first starting to read her at Above the Law, a insider New York sort of law blog that covered the drama around big law firms and the changing worlds of lawyers. She had a big privacy story even back then, which we'll come back to because I want to talk about the book. But if we have time, we'll come back to Kashmir, Justice Scalia, the late, great Professor Joel Reidenberg, and an unusual panel about privacy that I was on. So, Kash, what intrigued you about this? I mean, you've covered facial recognition and some of the intrusive technologies over the years, but it looks like this company really caught your eye pretty early on. What sparked you to sort of the first big stories way back when you started covering this?
There are a few different things. What the company had done, that Clearview had gone out and, collected billions of photos from, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Venmo, and all these public sites, and put it all together into this very easy to use facial recognition app where you could just take a photo of somebody and it pulls up all the photos online. When I first heard that they were doing this and selling it to law enforcement, I just didn't. I was like, how did this company I've never heard of and no one I know of has heard of? How did they come out of nowhere and do this? Why isn't it Facebook that did this or Google that did this? And so I was just intrigued by what they had accomplished, kind of technologically. And then once I started digging into the people behind the company, they were really initially trying to stay behind the scenes. It was very shadowy. And as I began to figure out who was involved and get their backstories, it was just a really interesting cast of characters. And I just kept digging and digging, hearing more and more, and going to my editors at the New York Times over and over again saying, I think we should do another story. I think we should do another story. My editors were like, you've got a book here. This is a book. And facial recognition itself, I just found the history of it fascinating. Like, how did we get to this moment? How did it get so good? And, I've been writing about privacy for a decade, and sometimes it's hard to get people excited about a privacy issue or the privacy harms. But with the face, it was so visceral and people just immediately get it. And the way that the face is going to become this key to unlocking everything that's kind of been gathered about us online over the last few decades, where, you just walk into Madison Square Garden, and if you're a lawyer who works at a firm that sued them, they can just turn you away and say, hey, you're not allowed in here until your firm drops that case, even if you're not involved in it. I just think that power is really going to change how we navigate the world. And so I wanted to dive into it. And it was so much fun writing this book, even though it's very creepy, it's alarming. I mean, I loved working on it.
I worry that it's inevitable, despite, I think, the alarm, and maybe hopefully the book will sort of add to that. But it does seem like what seems to be alarming, what seems to be creepy, what seems to be Orwellian, we suddenly start getting comfortable with it. Not everybody, but we're using versions of these technologies, right? I mean, logging into my phone is different than being identified in public, but the notion that I'm logging into my phone, tagging and grouping photos, again, different level of intrusiveness, but the underlying technologies of, searching and matching and so forth. When the world of cookies started, we won't let it be personal. It's even better. It's just a cookie, right? And then years later, the cookie becomes the global social security unique identifier with all the data of humans attached to it. And maybe now, because of legislation and platform changes, there's a bit of a pushback. But what was considered extreme and nobody would go there became a dominant business model. I remember when mobile phones started having location, and we get location. That's more sensitive, right? And now location is bought and brokered and sold. And now that I use global entry and I have my face letting me onto airplanes and my face is unlocking, is this the sort of extreme nature of what we saw here? And I guess, the legitimate backlash, is it your sense, as someone who's been writing about this for years, that this is just creeping into reality? I mean, these little guys did this without rocket science, leading global experts. They just clutched together. The founder, he does seem like, a pretty good technologist, but he's not, Nobel Prize winning, highly educated with research papers. He seemed like a super smart guy who just pulled together all the research that was out there and had the gall and, the determination to go pay and pull photos, right? I mean, are there a dozen other Clearview eyes that we don't know about? Is the NSA actually already doing this, just not, as noisy and visible? The UK's got cameras everywhere. This wasn't hard for them to do, right? I mean,
yeah. I mean, when I first discovered what they had done, I thought it was a technological breakthrough. But what I have learned over time doing all this reporting is that it was really just ethical arbitrage. They were willing to do what others weren't, even though the technology had kind of been open sourced over 10 years. And it was, I mean, this could have happened 10 years ago. And, as I report in the book, Google and Facebook developed, tools internally that could kind of do what Clearview had done. And they decided, we can't release this. This is too radical. This is too taboo. But there's been this open sourcing of technology over the last 10 years that made it possible for somebody like Kwantan Tat to come along and kind of assemble it, right? And put it together. And there are other Clearviews. There is a site called pimeyes.com that is essentially, Clearview is restricted to law enforcement use now, but PimEyes anyone can use. And, you just go there. You can even do a free search on your face. If you pay, you kind of get to see where the photos came from. And it works really, really well. And they're based in the country of Georgia, but corporate headquarters are in, the United Arab Emirates, and they have somewhere in the Caribbean is doing their kind of customer service, legal services. So you can just see how difficult something like this is. How do you regulate that company? And so I think unless we do something really seismic, like some serious regulation to kind of prevent companies from doing what they will, I think we'll all have an app like this on our phone, and that it could become commonplace to search the face of somebody you don't know. Like you'll just hold it'll just Shazam for people, and we'll get used to it. And it's part of why I wanted to write the book right now, is that I think this is the moment, if we don't want it to go that way, that we really need to act. From what I've seen when it comes to privacy laws, I kind of expect it will go that way, because it does seem hard for us to get in the way of technology.
Well, we'll see, I guess, widespread deployment of facial recognition in the Paris Olympics. It reminds me of the backlash that I think you mentioned in the book when it was the Florida, one of the big Super Bowls, deployed um, technology to try to find felons or the like who might be going to the game. Um,
This was
and
in 2001, dubbed the Snooper Bowl.
the Snooper Bowl, and now we'll see the French and the CNIL is going to oversee this, so there will be rules about proportionality and necessity and deletion and minimization, and so maybe we'll learn because of the overlay of European data protection law what the legitimate balanced use is, or maybe we will get comfortable with the fact that we need this because of security post 9/11. Obviously people were demanding all kinds of protections and weren't thinking through the consequences. So where is before we get to where this company stands today, because as you noted, there's enforcement fines pending with the CNIL. There's the Illinois lawsuit. Certainly, they seem to be surviving somehow, I guess, with the contracts they have with law enforcement. Some of these folks sometimes think that no publicity is bad publicity, because potential customers who could care less about the publicity but are becoming aware of the product, reach out and want to use it. Let's go through a little bit of the interesting sort of history. Peter Thiel is somehow connected. New York City politics. How did this company evolve, from this interesting, immigrant who came with ambition and drive and, some degree of, relationships, and turn this, into this, I don't want to say successful, but company that seems to have captured a lot of contracts with law enforcement?
Yeah, so Juan Tontat, he is from Australia, and he was really interested in technology since he was a little kid growing up in Melbourne and Canberra. Just loved computers and went to university. Was kind of bored by what the professors were teaching. Spent a lot of time on what became Hacker News, and got invited by an investor named Naval Ravikant to move to San Francisco. This was back in 2007, and kind of try his hand at making it in, the new Silicon Valley economy. And so he, at 19 years old, flies across the world to San Francisco, couch surfs for a while, and just starts doing the stupid Facebook games that everyone loved right then, like the Would You Rather. And so he's just building Facebook games, making money, because that was just exploding at that point. People were flocking to Facebook. Facebook had just let in third-party developers. And then that kind of died down, and he got an iPhone. He started building iPhone games, but he was just one of those kind of early entrepreneurs, just trying to figure out what works, how can I make money off of this bustling new economy that had kind of sprung up in that time after the first tech crash. And he ran into some controversy. He tried to create something that was a little bit like YouTube, and it was called Video. And he wanted it to go viral. So he would force people to log in with their kind of instant message credentials. And then he would grab those and use them to message everyone they knew, saying, check out Video. I want you to look at this video. And it became this huge, it started going too viral. It was like one of those early internet worms that started spreading really quickly. And, he got shut down. The police were looking for him. There were all these posts about him, including on, Gawker Valley Wag, that said he's, basically he's a scammer and he created this worm. He's a hacker. That's what they said. He's a hacker. And so it was not a great thing to have in his Google footprint when he's trying to kind of make it as an entrepreneur. But he's stayed in the tech industry, eventually got tired of San Francisco, moves to New York, where he really kind of fell in with a more conservative crowd. Met a guy named Charles Johnson. They went to the Republican National Convention together in 2016. They're both Trump supporters, really excited about him. And it was there that they were thinking as they're going through the crowds of the convention, man, it would be really great if you had a way to know who people were and kind of judge people. This is according to Johnson's retelling of events. It was interesting with this company, everyone had, a different kind of story about what happened. And Peter Thiel was speaking there. And so they ended up meeting with Peter Thiel. And this was right after Thiel had basically bankrupted Gawker with the Hulk Hogan lawsuit. And so Juan Tontat was really thankful to Thiel because, Gawker had destroyed his own reputation. And this was the seed of the company that came. Johnson introduced Juan Tontat to a contact he had in New York named Richard Schwartz, who was kind of a longtime political operator, had worked in the Giuliani administration. And the three of them just started sending a whole bunch of emails around, which I actually got access to. So I could see as they tried to plan what became Clearview AI. And so it is kind of amazing, just the tale of the company itself, how they were able to build what they built with kind of like, sticks and tape and and just a lot of web scraping.
So presumably they're maybe shut down in Europe, or at least there've been fines and enforcements, whether some agencies are using them without a lot of visibility. I guess that may not, but they're currently providing services to police departments or commercial operators currently in the US. I mean, they're making money at present.
Yeah, so originally they wanted to sell this to lots of different people, like hotels, retail stores, but law enforcement was the customer that really stuck. And so at the time that I first reported on them in January 2020, they were working with hundreds of US law enforcement, and they had some success internationally, and a lot of people were doing free trials with them. But when the story came out, there was such a big backlash. And then there were investigations by various privacy regulators and, Canada, France, Greece, the UK, Australia, more said what Clearview had done was illegal under their privacy laws, that it was not allowed to gather their citizens' photos without consent and build this, facial recognition app with them. And so Clearview just kind of pulled out of those markets. And so it's mostly operating in the US right now, as I understand it, primarily with law enforcement agencies. And there were fines issued, almost probably $100 million in fines that were issued by Europe, and they just have not been paying them. And I'm not sure at what point they kind of will be forced to do that, if ever, given that they're not doing business there. I think it's hard for the privacy regulators to enforce those rulings. And then in the US, they had a big class action lawsuit filed against them in Illinois over the Biometric Information Privacy Act, BIPA. And that lawsuit is coming to an end right now. They keep doing filings with the court that say we're hammering out a settlement. We're really close. And so I am really wondering how much they're going to pay, because that is the law that has cost technology companies so much. Facebook paid $650 million in Illinois because it had rolled out automated face tagging of friends and photos. So yeah, I for one am like just waiting for that to see what's going to happen next with this company.
Our friend Tara Talman points out the inaccuracy because of the way this technology is particularly inaccurate for darker skin, ethnic minorities. But you follow some of that debate in the book, and it's clear that although today there are still huge gaps, and you point out some of the interesting examples of the Amazon technology being used at a particular default setting that wasn't good enough, but yeah, that's what people do. They use the default setting, and how police officers are regularly. I think you had a recent New York Times story, right? That somebody was just arrested, some completely ridiculous, where like the cops should have shown up and been like, there's no way this could be the person. And so it's clear that although we might say, oh, just use this as a lead and then go investigate, people are people. You have lawyers filing briefs using, artificial intelligence, despite disclaimers that say this thing doesn't work, but humans do things and law enforcement does stuff, and so it gets misused. But it's clear that that gap is going to be solved at some point, right? The technology is getting more accurate. We probably shouldn't put all of our, eggs in the basket of, oh, it isn't accurate enough for certain, subgroups, because that's just a matter of having enough data and that'll be solved. That doesn't solve the problem of every single one of us being a, potential suspect in a database because of technology. And then getting in, having to prove our innocence, after being in jail or being arrested or anything else. This really is maybe one of the first examples of the risks of AI and machine learning, right? We think of facial recognition as this sort of technology, but it is an application of machine learning with all the risks and all the biases. And somehow we're aware of it when it comes to ChatGPT, but we're not as aware of it as we should be when it comes to sort of what seems to be, as intrusive a technology.
Yeah. I mean, with facial recognition technology, there's a handful of people now who have been falsely arrested based on a match. The most recent one you were talking about, woman 8 months pregnant, have, police come to her door on a Thursday morning while she's getting her 2 kids ready for school, and they tell her she's being arrested for carjacking and robbery. So we're seeing it happening. It's only happened to Black people so far that we know of. Lots of defense attorneys, criminal defense attorneys, tell me that there are more examples that are out there that are not public. It's sometimes hard to come forward in a case like that. You don't always want the attention or the attention to the fact that you've been arrested. But I think any technology that's deployed in a racist system, racist criminal justice system, is going to have racist occurrences come out of it. I mean, that's just the nature of a system like that. But with facial recognition technology, the technology has come a long way. And in testing scenarios where you have, a certain quality of input image, they're finding that there's very little what they call differential performance now, where it works equally well on different groups. And so there's a lot of caveats there. These systems don't work as well when it's a low quality, like a grainy image from a surveillance camera, but it is working incredibly well, being very accurate. So I really think we need to change some of the conversation to what do we do when facial recognition is very, very accurate. And it is, kind of trivial to track people by their face very easily on cameras and just day to day in our lives.
So calls to ban the technology seem to have fallen on deaf ears. We see more and more, instances of deployments from potentially intrusive ones that'll be highly regulated, perhaps like the Paris Olympics, to, the trivial, relatively trivial things like grouping photos and, getting access to your phone. Is this inevitable that we're just going to need to figure out the right regulatory structure because there is such demand or such reasonable utility? I read about blind users who, want to be able to identify people in their workplace. I have a friend, when Google Glass launched, she was enormously frustrated that it didn't allow any kind of face recognition. Her kid has a number of disabilities, including a not that unusual one, evidently, where he doesn't recognize people he should recognize. Like, he'd come to school every day and be scared by the teachers and by the caregivers. He's got a number of disabilities, and she's like, I want this to be an assistive technology for him. Why is that big dumb company being, ridiculous about this when it could help my kid? And I remember explaining to her, well, I appreciate that this might help your kid, but look at what this means. It means people walking around and, everyone they encounter, being identified, and maybe people don't want to be accountable for every place they go, every step they take. Are we, because there is such utility, right? I mean, we land, we walk up to the machine, we walk into the country and don't wait on the big line. Is the answer, from kind of where you're sitting, seeing both the utility and the gruesome uses? Is it just putting strict rules, limiting retention, limiting law enforcement use? Is this inevitable, and we just better be putting the right regulatory structure around it as quickly as possible? Or
I think use by law enforcement is inevitable. It's just I did talk to so many police officers who used it in really horrific crimes, and allowed them to solve them. Get child victims out of exploitative situations. I think one of the big questions is, should we regular people have access to the same kind of technology that police will have? And then we are seeing it happen in certain states now, better regulation of how police do use it. When do you get to use it? What are the steps that you need to go through before you arrest somebody? And the problem right now is they're supposed to be doing more investigating when they get a hit, with face recognition hit, but a lot of times they're just not doing that much more. And so really getting more kind of strict guidelines there. But yeah, I mean, I can see this being useful in so many ways. I did a story actually this summer about how OpenAI, when they built ChatGPT, also built a kind of visual version of ChatGPT that is able to analyze images. And they kind of inadvertently built a face recognition machine because it was scraping, photos from the internet that were with people's names. It was able to identify some people. And I talked to the host of this great tech podcast called Living Blindfully, and the host, looks at different technologies through the lens of somebody who is vision impaired. And he had been using an early version of this and said, I really appreciate this. Like, I need this as a blind person. But OpenAI decided to turn it off because they didn't want to be the company that, was offering that kind of power at this point. And so we do have a decision right now to make. Do we want this to be a power that anybody has? You could imagine a company like Facebook offering a facial recognition tool like this that you opt into, that you say, I'm willing to have my face be recognized, or I'm not willing. So I could kind of imagine something like that really comes out of not necessarily regulators, but out of the companies themselves, kind of while obeying the law, figuring out what consumers want.
I remember after reading Super Sad True Love Story by Gary Stenger, the notion that we all would have some device, and this maybe even was before Facebook or early on, where when you went into a nightclub, you went into some place, it would kind of broadcast aspects of you here in this, weird, funny novel, your virility and your wealth and so forth. But like, clearly, it seems like some of those tools in real space never worked out. LinkedIn had a feature at some point where you could turn on, maybe at a conference, something that broadcast your LinkedIn profile, and then people who you encountered, would know to walk up to you. And it just seems like people weren't super, interested. We'll see the next versions of smart glasses pretty soon, right? Whatever the Facebook Ray-Ban glasses evolve to, other tools like that. So, you mentioned, for some of our watchers know that I spent part of my career earlier in New York politics. And one of my nemesis in New York when I was the Consumer Affairs Commissioner was John Katsimatidis, the baron of supermarkets. And our inspectors would issue many, many fines because of a range of issues, which he wouldn't pay. And when they got big enough, we'd have to sue him. And so he was sort of always complaining to the mayor about me. I was a Democrat in a Republican administration, so sort of suspect for my over consumer proclivities, that, he was going to leave New York and take all his Gristedes supermarkets. I'm like, Mayor, how's he going to move his supermarkets out of New York? He's got to pay his fines. He's violating the law. Anyway, Kashmir has a really colorful story about this baron worried about somebody his daughter was dating and using an early access to this to figure out who the guy was and have a little bit of background information on him. But there are so many other stories like that. We don't want to give them all away. so many other sort of human interest, practical drama stories. We didn't even touch sort of some of the big tech drama and so forth that Kashmir writes a bit about as this technology rolled out. Some wonderful scenes about a young staffer for Senator Franken named Alvaro Bedoya, now FTC commissioner, and his early activism with the senator on this issue, and some real fabulous behind the scenes background. All right, let's close with the little story that I alluded to at the beginning. Once upon a time, I was on a panel in New York with Justice Antonin Scalia, my father-in-law, who had been a Supreme Court litigator, and a rabbi. Yes, there was like a joke about, somebody walks into a bar with a horse and a monkey, and a panel is Scalia, me, my father-in-law, and a rabbi. And they all make these big speeches and, talk about privacy was the topic. And I get up and I talk about internet privacy. And then Scalia gets up and Scalia says, I was told that this was informal remarks. And these gentlemen have just offered all these elaborate keynotes, Polonetsky, privacy, 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 internet, this, that. Where is all this in the Constitution? And he does this broadside criticizing all of us, telling the audience how each of us intellectually, legally, factually, we're all wrong. And there are no such rights to privacy that we are pontificating about. And I'm like, oh my God, we've gotten this justice who's going to be sitting on some of these cases riled up and like going down this terrible anti-privacy path. And finally, when there's a chance for me to, next engage on the panel, I said, Justice Scalia, you're a privacy hero. You were the majority opinion in the Kylo case, the case about the cops using a digital device to detect the heat from someone's garage. He interrupts me. His house and his garage, implying that maybe if it was just the garage, well, the Constitution maybe protects your house, maybe not your garage. Oh, no. Anyway, Professor Joel Reidenberg is sitting in the audience, and he hears this. And every year he used to assign his privacy law class a public figure for them to research, to sensitize them to how much incredible information is out there. And they had to go without paying for any special services, sort of show what kind of a dossier can be put together. And in fact, he, having sat in that audience and heard the Scalia diatribe, decides to assign Justice Scalia. And the students go off and they come up with these, incredibly detailed reports. And somehow Kashmir hears about this. And
at a conference where Joel Reidenberg was on a panel. This is why you should go to panels. They're great.
And she writes about it in, I guess it was Above the Law at the time. And Justice Scalia reads it and he's not happy. And he sends some very nasty public messages.
So I watched Joel Reidenberg. He's talking about doing this dossier on Scalia. I was a little baby blogger at Above the Law at the time. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, I was asking more questions. And he said, I'm a blogger for Above the Law. I'm going to write about this. Have you told Scalia about the dossiers? He's like, no, I wasn't planning on doing that. And I was like, well, just so you know, I'm going to reach out to the Supreme Court for comment. So he's probably going to hear about it. And I think Joel wasn't super happy initially that I was going to write about it. But I ended up reaching out to Scalia. And through the Supreme Court, he gave me a pretty scathing statement that said, what is legal is not necessarily ethical, and kind of shaming Reidenberg for signing his class to do this. And it became and so I blogged it for Above the Law, and then it became this big story. And, my now employer, the New York Times, covered it, but then Scalia didn't give anyone else a comment. So they had to keep citing Above the Law, which was nice.
But was that part in privacy related reporting, perhaps?
I was interested in privacy already. I had gone to journalism school and started this blog called The Not So Private Parts that I was doing on the side. I was doing a lot of hustling in those early days. And so it was a second blog I had on top of Above the Law. But yeah, part of the reason why I was so interested in privacy was because Above the Law was really skirting that line. We were reporting on law school students and lawyers and law professors and people you wouldn't consider public figures. And so it had me thinking a lot about the role of journalists and what privacy people should have.
folks, September 19th, the book comes out. Pre-order it. It's as exciting as it sounded. We touched only on a bit of it. If you care about privacy, if you're into data protection, if you're interested in tech policy, or if you just want a great drama about great reporting, a story that isn't, I think, yet over, you will enjoy. Tara, thanks for joining us. Wojciech, thanks for joining us. Our friends who commented. Keep an eye out for Kashmir's byline. You ought to have like a Google alert so that when she posts, it's always a story that is incredibly interesting for folks in our community. Thank you for joining, and look forward to continuing to follow this story. There's a motion picture coming for sure. Maybe when the strike's over, because there's a lot of drama to this story, and the last chapter isn't yet written, and Kashmir is probably going to be writing those next stories. So thanks, everybody. Happy Friday. Thanks for joining us. And Kashmir, thanks for being with me.
Thanks so much, Jules.